stop reflecting light at you. But anyway, that's pretty much. Oh yeah, when they actually don't care, they actually don't use that outer rim, and instead they actually use opportunities to test different things. This is actually the first case where they actually started really playing with the idea of using a shadow flare, the idea of using elements outside of the actual driver to actually make the whole entire baffle a acoustic making the entire baffle acoustic essentially. See how the surround has a line right there? This is a specially designed surround that actually continues from the contour of the horn, that allows for the horn to continue all the way down and strike this shadow flare, the first instance of the shadow flare. And see how this one here is actually just like a normal surround. They had to actually custom make this surround right here, so you couldn't actually replace this surround with a normal surround. You had to actually like get the driver from them, which already has this surround, or buy the surround from them, because it's so specific that it actually follows the contour of this flare. And the center speaker, because people didn't really care about measuring the center speaker so much, they could do whatever they want with it, right? So when they designed it, they just kind of used it as a way of prototyping what would be the next phase. And the next phase would be to bypass the surround and use the outer elements. And the next phase immediately became something that was very, very similar. See? Bypasses and then outer shadow flare. But then in addition, that contoured waveguide. And that's where that's why they actually started, that's where they got the idea for the blade. In fact, you look at this thing actually pretty much looks like a blade. This thing is actually like shaped like a freaking sword. And it looks like, if I were to hold it from the bottom, like it's some kind of really fancy like lance or something. Also, another feature that's really cool about it, that is part of its engineering that I find really amazing, that for some reason they just did it for this speaker, and there's so many things they did only for this speaker that were just brilliant, and they just never did it for any other speaker. So first of all, like this shape right here is actually tone. It's actually like it's an ellipse, right? So that means that naturally it's gonna phase destroy its own resonance, so it doesn't really have any issue with ringing, right? It has no specific tone that you can hear. It kind of sounds like just a bunch of phasing as I'm going up and down, whereas when I hit it from the front, I get kind of the same very dull tap. But even though there isn't any one specific resonance, any one specific pitch, the relationship of the pitch between this and this are actually 1 and 5. Here, let me get something to show you that has a better resonance. Alright. You hear how those are two pitches? Dut, 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 dut. Dut, 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 dut. So even though there isn't really a consistent pitch up and down, if you stay at one level and go, that's called a perfect fifth. That's the first note and the fifth note of a triad. It's also what you sing when you sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. It's twinkle twinkle little star, dun 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 dun. Hear it? That's really clever. So what that means is that even with this thing not being filled, even though you could actually fill it with damper, it actually naturally plays a harmonic fifth. which is naturally something that our ears just like anyway. So it doesn't have any specific resonance, but when it does play along with the speaker, whatever it does add, it adds a harmonic fifth, which is just a really, really cool thing because it just naturally adds like a sound that is pleasant to the ear that just kind of works. It's the basis of, you know how punk rock works? Punk rock works because distortion plus a 1 and a 5 equals the harmonic fifth and all the phase anomalies in between, sounding like it's a really cool chord. That's how two notes, when you do a punk rock, like, you know, when you do a punk chord, it's just a 1 and a 5. That's how it's called a chord. It's not really a chord. They're actually playing it using distortion, and then by playing the 1 and the 5, the distortion fills in the harmonics in between, which gives you so you get the perfect 1 and 5, and then the distortion adds the phase and all the rich texture in between and makes it so it sounds like it's a chord. That's essentially what's happening here. This thing is essentially a punk rock tube. It phases, and it will always play a 1 and a 5 punk rock power chord. And also the way they made the round stand. For some reason, the ones who, like all the stands they made that were for speakers like this, they made them either round or square, right? And all the round ones were always round. Even the ones they made afterward, they were always round. And I don't know why, because this thing has a cutout right here. That cutout right there, that saves on shipping, right? It saves on materials. It also looks pretty cool, right? But it also has a function, just like the same way this thing here isn't just a cool harmonic fifth and really easy to grab and to turn because it fits in your hand like a sword. But that cutout there leads to these 2 points becoming teeth, which actually makes this thing into a tripod. Because just like the way this thing being an ellipse is stronger forward and backward than it is side to side, this thing, if I was to blast it, could only tip backward on axis. If an earthquake were to happen, it would just rock like that. It would always stay on axis. And if I wanted to rake this thing, I would only have to add one object right here, right in the middle, like that. If I wanted to rake it up, I'd have to just use one spike and it would form a tripod. That's all I need, whether I'm on carpet or on a hardwood floor or anything. And even despite that, yeah, even when I'm on, whether I'm on carpet or right now I'm on carpet, and it still works as far as being able to lock itself on axis so that it doesn't actually wobble. If this thing was rounded, it would work the other way, right? Where, like, watch, when I tilt it like forward, I could actually rock in any direction, and that's not good. That makes it so that my positioning is now not on the same axis that I had it, which is what I wanted. This thing naturally pushes itself backward because of the force of the driver and the way that there's, basically air that is only generated forward and then a downward pressure from the vent or the port, so this thing can only push itself forward and backward. And when it tries to do so, it's locked on axis because it has the two fangs in the back. So I don't know why they actually don't do that anymore. Like whenever they do like round bases, they just make them round, which is dumb. Because the advantage of having it being round makes a lot of sense, right? You could actually grab it and just turn it, and so that you could actually like direct it very easily. These things are great as studio monitors. And yeah, so they're really light, and it's just, you can just spin it in place so it fits in tight places. So wherever it fits, you could just turn it, right? It'll always be able to be rotated to wherever it fits. It will always fit in any direction. But once you get in that direction, it'll always lock on axis. And that is some clever engineering that for some reason KEF just completely forgot about. They just stopped doing. They actually didn't only just do it for these either. The inspiration for this actually came from this. This is the HTB2. The HTB1 actually was paired with the XQ series. The last of the classic Uniqs. That was the driver that I was showing you, was actually the driver to the XQ40. And it was the last of the classic last of the classic Uniqs to play up to 55 kilohertz. This right here is last of the new Uniqs to play up to 55 kilohertz, plus or minus 3 dB. The Blade plays up, I believe, up to 48, while this thing, I believe, plays up to like 32. But yeah, these are the only ones that play up to 55 kilohertz because of the need for their use as prototypes. And their ability to be used as prototypes is actually pretty damn amazing. I've taken this thing apart, and the amount of work you could do with this thing is amazing. In fact, you could actually take this thing, this tweeter, and fit it into this, believe it or not. This is actually an illusion. This is actually not one solid woofer. You could actually remove this whole entire plug here, and this tweeter fits exactly into, see this ring right here? That ring is exactly the same exact size as this ring. So this thing can literally support this tweeter, which is pretty funny, because as like a prototype, it was actually that useful that they could actually adjust it that much. And also, not only that, but like the way the driver was designed is that they inverted the coil so that the motor was actually made out of a series of discs that were all made out of different magnetic compositions. And the way they were stacked would determine how powerful the magnet was. And also the magnetic behavior, the whole pattern, it basically it formed its own magnetic array and behave accordingly. And that's how they're able to convert these to the modern ultra slim woofers. As if you look at the ultra slim woofer catalogs, like all the ads, you'll notice that it's this it's this driver that they use as a reference model. And it is literally this thing that they used to turn into the ultra slim woofer. The radial ribs, see those little lines? Have these little fins in the back. And those little fins, on these right here, what they do is it actually forces air from the center outward. And then that way, air from the center is not only forced backward, but it's forced outward and backward. And then it pressurizes this whole entire horn out through the port, which gives you like the crazy ability to go down to like 45 hertz. These two have the same port tuning at 52 hertz, believe it or not. And the flexibility of the radiators, the fins on the back of these things, would be the same sort of internal dithering that the flexible port on this thing has. So that way, like the rear end, the inside of this thing has like the ability to have a springiness to its rear port tuning, because the way that the actual rear of the driver works is it actually has these fins that kind of flap, I guess you would say, since each of these fins are, I don't have a driver on hand right now, but if you look it up, each of these fins are long enough that when they push backward, not only do they dampen any of the resonance that can exist along this thing, almost like an acoustic heat sink, but since they're actually they're radial, so they're more bunched up together in the center than they are, and they kind of spread out, outward. That means any air in the center is forced to travel outward, and it actually has to push between the blades, the fins, and the fins themselves actually end up having to agitate and become pretty much a form of, it almost forms like a type of windshield or air shield, because the fins themselves trap so much air pressure from sprawling the air backward that it's impossible for this thing to actually have any rear ring distortion, because there's just so much force from the air being forced outward and backward at the same time from the reinforced ridges, fins. And those fins actually made their way to the blade. The blade actually has the same things. They call them ribs for some reason. I would have called them cross guards, just to go with the whole like sword analogy that they keep going with. But yeah, it has the same structure that they made out of a polymer of some sort that they actually add to the back of their aluminum magnesium cone. The back of it actually has the same fins that these things have, which is how they're able to get the Unicue in such a shallow vessel as the pod on the blade and not have any issues with rear wing distortion. The rear wing distortion, the distortion on this thing, if you actually look at measurements of even just this thing in the catalog, downward to about 200 hertz, it's below point. It maximizes at 0.2%, but it averages at about 0.05%. And if you cross over at 300, then it basically is the same as the blade. And what's kind of cool is that you can actually cross it over with this thing, because this thing actually secretly plays up to 350. So you can actually make this thing cross over at 300 and have this thing cross over with this, and you end up with something that basically sounds like the blade, which is kind of why it ends up sounding so good when you switch it from this thing to this thing. But yeah, like I was saying before, the inspiration behind the feet, they actually did the same thing here. It has a really cool kind of like bat wing like shape. And I thought that was just meant for like a cool design motif, but it's not just a cool design motif. They could have made it rounded, right? And yeah, it definitely does save metal by making it. I knocked my quarter down. Oh yeah, this thing has magical force canceling capabilities, even though it has only one driver. Whatever. Yeah, so that coin's been staying on its edge the entire time. Anyway, but these points right here also allow it to dig into carpet. If I place this thing on fluffy carpet, these points right here would actually prevent the thing from actually wobbling forward and backward, because this would bite into the carpet forward and backward. As much as you would ever need this thing to ever stand still, even though it dampens itself to the point where it doesn't even need these teeth, they designed it that way anyway. So I don't think this really actually has that, as far as you look how deliberate this is. This is like a very deliberate sharp tooth. These things have more of a rounded thing, so I think that's more of just like a motif, a design aesthetic that they just kind of they wanted to keep in common, but they actually made them functional with these, so that when they're tilted back, they always stay on axis, which is pretty damn clever. So yeah, I don't know, anything else more to cover on these? Yeah, so we covered how KEF basically cheats with their ability to hack the mono speaker test by using the outer radiation ring to use as a augmented way of tuning their response, so that on axis it would actually have a performance chart, a graph that would be completely different than its actual real use performance, which would be at a distance and at an angle. And how you can actually see that the same tricks of having the flare and then the flat portion can be tracked back to here, where they also use this flat portion here. So this gave it a bit more oomph as far as like the woofer, but as far as the tweeter only has the ability to use the flare that is actually inside of the outer rim. There's no name for it, right? Except for if you're on axis, which you're never really supposed to be. So on axis, KEFs always basically play the game. They always use an element like this to basically mess with the testing, so that it actually ends up being the way they want. Meanwhile, in real life use, when you're at a distance and then listening to them the way they're supposed to be listened to, off axis and at a distance, it actually gives you a completely different experience. Same thing happens here as far as like, their weird obsession with phi. It's not weird, it's actually a pretty smart obsession, but this is also a relationship between phi right here, where it's you cut off right here and cut off right here. This is 1 to 1.6, and this is 1 to 1.6 down there. Which means that these two drivers, even though they're supposed to be in parallel and in sync, don't actually play in sync. This bottom one always plays a little bit lower and lags a little bit behind this one behind this one, even though they're supposed to be in sync. It plays as if they're actually a fur away. So when you measure these things, they measure as if when you're up close, they measure like they do play these two at the same exact time. And this thing, so it's supposed to be as if this tweeter and this woof and this mid and these two are 3 different timed components, right? These two play at the same time, this plays at the same time, and that plays at the same time, as far as like, to cover the range. But in reality, due to the way they built the box, this actually plays at a different rate than this thing does. And when you're at a distance, it actually makes a big difference, because this thing actually sounds like it's actually more distant than this thing, and actually plays at a lower frequency than this thing does. And it gives it this really interesting bloom, and naturally breaks down any potential like duplicate standing waves that could happen between these two, since that never plays in sync with that unless you're up close. When you're at a distance, then they're always going to be out of sync. So these speakers are pretty much impossible to measure. So yeah, when they don't care about measurements, you can see like a lot of experimentation being done here. The little surround there, something I never really noticed before, is actually a mesh. The thing's actually breathable. And so when I took these things apart, what I noticed is that you can't actually, they actually started flooding the market with pirated diaphragms to these things ever since like we pretty much created like a whole weird army of people who would just swap them and then try to get as much of a matching set as possible, and basically cleared all of eBay. So there's like this gigantic spiking demand for these for some reason, and then now all of a sudden there's a gigantic amount of people trying to pirate the tweeters, even though the tweeters are impossible to pirate. But the tweeters are actually pretty interesting in the sense where, it's first of all, you cannot actually replace the tweeters to these things. It's actually like literally impossible. It's utterly impossible. So if you were to, I don't know what's gonna happen to those pirated tweeters. It's funny they're even trying to sell them, but the little surround around that thing is actually vented, which I actually found pretty interesting. It's actually like a little mesh, so it allows. So this tweeter is not only inside of a space that has a gap about this big, because the voice coil is actually right here. The voice coil, just like on the blade, is actually about 1/3 its way in, which leaves a gigantic gap for the tweeter to be in the center. And that gives the tweeter, and the voice coil also has a whole bunch of holes along the top. So it also gives like the chamber a whole bunch of air vents. So the tweeter basically has all the air it could ever need to breathe, to cool down its coil, and to, eliminate any, I guess, rear wave diffraction or whatever. It has the ability to vent actually through its outer mesh and through the side little holes that it has inside of like the side of the actual tweeter itself. And it's inside of a chamber that's gigantically oversized. It's like this big. And it has surrounding it a Kapton voice coil that's 2 inches that is straddling it like that has holes on top that allows it to even have access to more air. And I think that's how they actually managed to make this thing so damn durable. I actually blasted this thing up to 180 watts, and I thought I'd blow out the tweeter, but I didn't. What happened was I just ended up, it just popped the actual tweeter adhesive off, which ended up disconnecting one of the terminals. So I thought that meant I burnt it out, but I didn't smell anything. But so then once I actually took it apart, I realized that all that happened was the adhesive of the actual little mesh surround came off, and once I pushed it back in, it just started working again. So this thing is, it's I don't know, I could probably play it up to like 200 at a lower, I don't know, yeah, it's I could probably play it up to like 150 watts, and I bet you I could probably keep it going. Because if I could play it up to 180, the only thing that went wrong was that the tweeter adhesive came off. Then that means that at least that the woofer could actually be, used as something a lot more hardy. So I would be curious as far as how this thing could be used as like maybe even a little mini subwoofer or something. But anyway, enough speculation on just random crap. But yeah, that's pretty much like the history of like how KEF pretty much pwns the hi-fi market and have this kind of Apple-esque quality where they have like a reality distortion field where like, the LS50s and the Metas are somehow considered like the same speaker and not at the same time, even though clearly the LS50s are one speaker and they just wanted to use the same box, and then they stopped making the driver, so they made the new driver and put that new driver into that box and just called it the Metas. So they just didn't want to stop selling the most popular box they ever had, because they want to continue making them, and they weren't going to continue making the LS50 drivers and crossovers forever. So yeah, that's where the Metas came from. So there's all sorts of like little cool little really smart techniques that KEF use as far as R&D and marketing that goes into this like whole entire loop that I want to do. That's why I cover KEF so much, is that they're actually just a lot more clever and a lot more coy about what they do. Like when I first covered this thing about 6 or 7 years ago, I was just kind of stunned by how over engineered it was. Because of course, first thing I did was I popped it open and I looked inside, and like it was unlike anything I've ever seen. It looked like almost like an alien driver, and the fact that they made a custom driver from completely from scratch, and then the fact that they even made like every single component, including the binding post, from scratch. They recycled nothing, and this whole entire thing is made out of like wherever they could have saved money, they did the opposite. Like why did they even add a baffle? Why wouldn't they just make it like a plastic thing, or just make it solid metal and paint it black? Like those are the eggs up there, and they're convex. Why didn't they make it convex? So that it'd have more space and just be like an egg. They didn't make it an egg. They deliberately, very deliberately, made it contoured inward, which was odd. That was different. It was different than everything else they were doing. So when I was looking into it, I was like, what is going on here? They're definitely doing something different. They're experimenting. And not only that, but everything they're doing about it, they're actually using metal here. They're actually using metal here and rubber gaskets. And this thing has a recoil system so that when you actually blast it, it actually beats like a heart. The front and the back halves actually recoil like this, because it's actually tied together by these two rods that basically just are tight enough that it's airtight but not perfectly tight, so that it could actually expand and contract along the seam, which allows it to actually recoil and dampen itself, which is pretty neat. And its entire design is just made out of something that's almost as if it was designed for aeronautics or like a one-way mission through space or something. Like, why would you make custom binding posts when like binding posts you just are like one, there's billions of binding posts in the storeroom? Why would you want to make custom binding posts out of solid metal and then powder coat them for this one speaker and then never use them ever again? So yeah, all that stuff led me to think there had to be something that was interesting about the speaker. And yeah, and the more I looked into it, and even the fact that it could play up to 55 kilohertz, and no other KEF speaker could do that, that just totally made it obvious that it was a lost leader prototype. And the only thing that was keeping it like not obvious was that they were marketing it to casuals. So while they were marketing those to casuals, anyone who was like a little bit, they were a little bit heading more toward the high end, more towards the hi-fi, they would be more likely to buy something like this. It looks cleaner. It doesn't have any garish KEF thing on it, and it obviously exudes quality. So once you have this thing, you would actually be more likely to have an affinity to KEF, and you would more likely buy the next KEF, upgrade to another KEF thing from there. But the thing that makes this thing so versatile is also its Achilles heel. Its feet can swivel in every single direction. So when you first buy them, you're always going to have them positioned wrong. You're going to just plop them down, and they're going to be positioned in a way that is completely not aligned and not symmetrical. And not only that, but the way that they actually went and the logistics of the way they spread these, they sold them as 5.1s and then later on as stereo pairs, that shuffled them. So the variation as they would adjust this across the two generations that they occupy, since they literally stand for generation 7 and generation 8, like literally this one speaker stands for the two generations, they have so much variation between those like 4 or 5 years that you want to actually find the ones that match if you want them to sound good, because the way they actually milled them out and shuffled them, they actually don't match very commonly at all. they are, you have to pretty much look for clues that they came from the same factory. And if they have, for instance, serial numbers that are nearly consecutive, that's a good sign. If the waveguide is the same, it's a good sign. If the waveguide is exactly the same but exactly mirrored, it's also a good sign. Like exactly mirrored, it's also a good sign. Because like I have a set that's actually a prototyped match serial numbers with literally an L and an R inside the actual serial number, which is something obviously no consumer would ever need to know. And it's literally perfect in terms of its tolerance. Like if you were to do a pink noise cancellation test, it just goes silent. And also the way that the waveguide is aligned is exactly mirrored so that you could tell exactly which is which. And that was just necessary because if you're to do some prototyping, then you would need to know which one's the left one and which one's the right one, right? Yeah, so these things are pretty much the bridge between everything you'd want to know from where KEF is heading to where KEF changed from this and why KEF changed from this. It all basically started from here, and every generation that KEF goes actually ends up becoming more and more like this. They even started using a poly basket that was like this, and they added the same exact steel suspension gasket that's now common across all the 12th generation Uniqs, which came from this speaker. So the next step is to add the fins to all of them, which they'll probably do, and start playing around with adding the inverted voice coil. You could pretty much just like guess where they're going pretty much by looking at this design. But not only that, but if you had this thing, you could actually test stuff yourself by actually making your own baffles and just applying it and seeing how it sounds. You can actually make your own baffle like this big. You can make this into a void tube if you wanted to. Anyway, that's long enough about this is pretty much like the longest coverage I ever did of KEF. I just figured I'd just get one out there. Thanks.